You don't need that thing out here, the officer said, his voice cutting through the afternoon like a blade no one else could see, and for a moment, even the traffic seemed to hesitate. The city moved in its usual rhythm, cars rolling past at 25 miles per hour, the distant hum of a bus braking at the corner, snippets of conversation drifting through the late summer air. But around Evelyn Carter, everything slowed, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She stood on the edge of the sidewalk, her posture upright, one hand gently wrapped around the smooth handle of her white cane, the other resting near the strap of a worn leather bag that hung at her side. Dark sunglasses shielded her eyes, but her face was calm, almost serene, like someone who had learned to listen to things others overlooked. The shift of wind between buildings, the subtle echo of footsteps on concrete, the quiet kindness in a stranger's pause. She had been waiting for the crosswalk signal, counting the seconds in her head the way she always did, mapping the world through sound and memory. When the presence approached her, heavy boots, deliberate steps, authority carried in every inch. Officer Daniel Hayes didn't rush. He didn't need to. His uniform was pressed, his badge catching the sunlight in sharp flashes, his expression set in a firmness that left no room for questions. To him, the sidewalk was order, and anything that didn't fit his version of it needed to be corrected. "You're causing a disruption," he added, glancing briefly at the small portable speaker near Evelyn's feet, still humming softly with the last notes of a piano track she had been playing for passers-by. A few people lingered nearby, unsure whether to keep walking or stay, their eyes flicking between the officer and the woman who hadn't moved. Evelyn tilted her head slightly toward the sound of his voice, acknowledging him without fear, without resistance. "Sir," she said quietly, her tone even, grounded. "I'm standing where the curb guide is. I'm not in anyone's way." Her words didn't rise, didn't challenge, they simply existed, steady and certain, like truth spoken without needing to defend itself. But something in that calm seemed to unsettle him more than defiance ever could. Hayes exhaled sharply, shifting his weight, his gaze dropping to the cane in her hand as if it were the source of the problem itself. The sunlight caught its white surface, clean and unmistakable, a symbol not of weakness, but of navigation, of independence carved out in a world that rarely made space. Around them, a phone lifted discreetly, someone beginning to record, another person slowing their pace just enough to witness what might unfold. The air grew heavier, quieter, charged with something unspoken. Evelyn's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the cane, not in fear, but in awareness, as if she could feel the shift before it fully arrived. The officer reached forward, his movement quick, controlled, and in the next second, the gentle balance of the moment fractured, not with noise, but with meaning, as the one object that guided her through darkness was no longer whole, and for the briefest instant, the entire street seemed to forget how to breathe. The sound did not come from the cane alone, it came from everything it represented, and as the broken half settled against the pavement, a quiet ripple moved through the small crowd, not loud, not chaotic, just a shift in air, in posture, in conscience. Evelyn Carter did not step back. She did not reach out blindly in panic. Instead, she stood exactly where she was, her shoulders level, her breathing steady, as if the world had tilted but she had already learned how to stand on uneven ground. Her hand remained in the space where the cane had been, fingers slightly curled, remembering its shape, its weight, its guidance. Around her, footsteps slowed. Someone cleared their throat. A car passed by, its tires brushing against asphalt, but even that sound felt distant now, like it belonged to another place entirely. Officer Hayes straightened, adjusting his stance as if what had just happened required no explanation, his gaze sweeping briefly over the onlookers before returning to Evelyn with a kind of rigid certainty. "You will need to move along," he said, his tone clipped, procedural, as though he were reciting something memorized rather than responding to a human moment. Evelyn turned her face slightly toward him, not searching for his eyes, but listening for the space where his voice settled. There was no anger in her expression, no tremor in her lips, only a quiet awareness that seemed deeper than the moment itself. "Sir," she replied softly, "that was how I knew where the curb was." The words did not accuse. They did not demand. They simply existed, clear and unadorned, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across the officer's face, too quick to name, too small to hold. But it passed. He shifted again, glancing at the ground, at the two separate pieces that had once been whole, then back at her. "You can request assistance if needed," he said, already stepping half a pace back, as though the situation had been resolved the moment he decided it was. A woman near the edge of the sidewalk lowered her phone slightly, her brows drawn together, while a man in a business suit paused mid-step, his briefcase hanging loosely at his side. No one spoke. Not yet. The silence was not empty, it was full, heavy with the weight of people deciding whether to look away or stay. Evelyn slowly bent her knees, careful, deliberate, her hand reaching downward until her fingers brushed against the pavement, tracing the faint texture of concrete until she found the first piece of the cane. She lifted it gently, as though it were fragile in a way that had nothing to do with material, then searched for the second half, her movements guided by memory and instinct rather than sight. When she stood again, both pieces rested in her hands, not aligned, not usable, but still held with care. A soft breeze moved through the street, carrying with it the scent of warm asphalt and distant food carts, and for a moment, Evelyn tilted her face upward, as if measuring the direction of the sun against her skin. She did not ask for help. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, holding what remained, her presence quiet but unyielding, while somewhere beneath the surface of the moment, something unseen had begun to shift. Officer Daniel Hayes had built his reputation on control, on the kind of order that left no room for hesitation, and as he stood there on that sidewalk, he held on to that identity like it was part of the uniform itself. He had been on the force for 12 years, long enough to believe that instinct was the same as judgment, long enough to stop questioning the line between authority and assumption. In his world, things were either compliant or not, either fitting into place or needing to be corrected. And right now, to him, this situation had already been handled. He glanced once more at Evelyn, noting the way she stood without assistance, the way she did not call out or reach for anyone nearby, and something about that stillness unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. It did not match the reactions he expected, the patterns he had grown used to reading. Usually there was protest, confusion, raised voices, something that justified escalation or closure. But here, there was only quiet. Behind him, the faint murmur of the crowd began to shift into something more defined, not loud, but present. A man in his late 40s stepped slightly closer, his voice careful but firm. "Officer," she said, she had a permit. Hayes did not turn immediately. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tightening just enough to be felt but not seen. "That is not what this is about," he replied, each word measured, controlled. The man hesitated, then stepped back, the tension folding into silence again. Hayes adjusted the radio on his shoulder, a habitual motion, grounding himself in procedure, in routine, in the familiar weight of command. He told himself that what he had done was necessary, that public space required order, that exceptions led to complications. It was easier that way. Cleaner. But something lingered at the edge of his awareness, something small but persistent, like a sound just outside the range of hearing. He looked down again at the broken cane in Evelyn's hands, at the way she held both pieces with care instead of discarding them, and for a brief moment, his certainty wavered. Not enough to change his stance, not enough to step forward, but enough to register. Across the street, a delivery truck slowed, the driver leaning slightly out the window as if trying to understand the stillness gathering on the sidewalk. A cyclist rolled past at a reduced pace, glancing over his shoulder. The world had not stopped, but it had shifted its attention. Evelyn remained where she was, her presence neither retreating nor advancing, her posture grounded in something deeper than circumstance. She turned her head slightly, listening, not to the officer now, but to the environment around her, mapping it again without the tools she had relied on for years. The faint beeping of the crosswalk's signal began again, indicating it was safe to cross, a rhythmic sound repeating every few seconds, steady, indifferent. Normally, she would have stepped forward with confidence, counting her steps, aligning her direction with the tactile memory beneath her feet. Now, she did not move. Not because she could not, but because something in the moment held her there. Hayes noticed it too, the way she did not step into the street, the way she remained at the edge, suspended between motion and stillness. He shifted his weight again, less certain now of what came next, though he would not admit it, not to himself, not to anyone watching. Authority had always given him answers before. Today, for the first time in a long while, it did not. The crosswalk signal continued its steady rhythm, a soft electronic pulse repeating every few seconds, but Evelyn did not step forward with it, and that absence of movement began to carry more weight than any action could have. She shifted her grip slightly on the two pieces in her hands, aligning them for a moment as if testing whether they still belonged together, then letting them separate again, her fingers tracing the edges where smooth had become uneven. The sensation was subtle, but it told her everything she needed to know. Around her, the city breathed in fragments, a car door closing somewhere behind, a distant siren fading into the grid of streets, the low murmur of voices that had not yet decided whether to intervene or remain observers. Evelyn tilted her head just enough to catch the direction of the signal again, mapping the intersection in her mind, counting the approximate width of the street, the angle of the curb, the timing she had memorized over months of standing in this exact spot. "I usually cross in 12 seconds, she said quietly, not addressing anyone in particular, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard without demanding attention. "From this corner to the other side." The statement hung in the air, simple, precise, almost like a measurement spoken out loud so the world could understand the structure she relied on. Officer Hayes glanced at her again, his brow tightening, not in anger this time, but in something closer to uncertainty. He had expected resistance, perhaps frustration, something that would fit into the categories he knew how to respond to. But this was different. This was a person continuing to function within a system that had just been altered without her consent, adapting in real time without raising her voice. A woman near the curb stepped forward half a pace, then hesitated, looking from Evelyn to the officer as if asking for permission without speaking. Hayes noticed the movement, the subtle shift in the crowd, and something in him resisted it, not out of malice, but out of habit, out of the need to maintain control over a situation he no longer fully understood. "You should wait," he said, his tone softer now, less rigid, though still holding on to authority. Evelyn turned her face slightly toward him again, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded. "I have been waiting," she replied, her voice steady, carrying a quiet clarity that did not challenge him directly but did not yield either. The words settled between them, and for a moment either moved. The signal continued. The light changed. The opportunity passed. Traffic resumed its flow, cars rolling through the intersection at a measured pace, the brief pause erased as if it had never existed. Evelyn remained at the edge, not stepping back, not stepping forward, holding her position with a kind of quiet resolve that drew attention without asking for it. Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the surrounding noise, and adjusted his stance again, but this time it did not bring him the same sense of certainty. He looked at the street, then back at her, then at the fragments in her hands, and something unspoken began to press against the edges of his understanding, something that could not be resolved with a command or dismissed with a procedure. For the first time since he had stepped onto that sidewalk, he was not entirely sure what the next step was supposed to be. The moment stretched thinner than it should have, like time itself was being pulled between what had happened and what should happen next, and in that space, the tension finally began to surface, not through noise, but through the subtle fracture of control. A man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, closer now, his voice no longer hesitant but firm enough to carry. "She cannot cross without that," he said, not loud, but clear, each word landing with quiet weight. Another voice followed, softer but steady. "She did not do anything wrong." The murmurs began to layer, not chaotic, not aggressive, but present, undeniable, like a low current building beneath still water. Officer Hayes turned slightly, his posture tightening, eyes moving across the small circle that had formed, registering faces, phones, attention. This was no longer a contained interaction. It was becoming something else. Something visible. He lifted his chin, grounding himself in authority, in the structure he knew how to hold. "Everyone needs to keep moving," he said, his voice firmer again, attempting to reset the moment, to fold it back into order. But the shift had already happened. It did not reverse. Evelyn remained at the center of it, still and composed, the two pieces of her cane resting in her hands like something both broken and preserved. She did not turn toward the voices defending her. She did not acknowledge the growing attention. Instead, she adjusted her stance slightly, her shoes aligning with the edge of the curb, her body recalibrating to the environment through memory alone. The crosswalk signal began again, its steady pulse repeating, a sound she had trusted hundreds of times before. She listened, counting silently, mapping distance, timing, direction. Her fingers tightened around the broken pieces, not as tools now, but as anchors. Then, with a measured breath, she shifted her weight forward. It was not a step of confidence. It was a step of necessity. The crowd noticed immediately, a ripple of movement, a held breath passing from one person to another. A woman reached out instinctively, then stopped herself, unsure if help would be welcomed or refused. A car slowed in the nearest lane, the driver hesitating, sensing the unusual stillness unfolding in front of him. Hayes saw it too, the moment tipping towards something he could no longer control with words alone. "Wait," he said, the command leaving his mouth before he fully considered it, sharper than before, edged with something closer to urgency than authority. Evelyn paused mid-motion, not startled, not shaken, simply stopping where she was, her foot hovering just at the edge of the street. The signal continued its rhythm. The seconds passed. The world held. And in that fragile space, the weight of what had been taken from her became impossible to ignore, not because she spoke it, not because she demanded it, but because she stood there, poised between movement and risk, dignity intact, while everything around her finally began to feel the imbalance she had been carrying all along. The signal kept pulsing, steady and indifferent, but everything else seemed to fall away, like the city itself had stepped back to watch what would happen next, and in that narrowing space, Evelyn Carter lowered her foot slowly back onto the curb, not in retreat, but in decision. She exhaled, a quiet breath that barely moved the air, and adjusted her grip on the broken cane pieces, aligning them once more before letting them rest separately in her hands, her fingers tracing the familiar contours as if memorizing them again. The breeze shifted, brushing lightly against her face, carrying with it the faint warmth of the sun reflecting off nearby windows, and she turned her head just slightly, orienting herself not by sight, but by sensation, by the subtle language of the world she had learned to read without eyes. Around her, the crowd had gone still, not frozen in shock, but held in a kind of collective awareness, as if everyone present understood that something larger than a single moment was unfolding. A car idled at the edge of the intersection, engine humming softly, the driver waiting without being told. A cyclist placed one foot on the ground, balancing in silence. Even Officer Hayes did not speak. He stood a few feet away now, his posture no longer rigid, his arms no longer fixed at his sides, as though the certainty he had carried into this moment had quietly dissolved into something he could not yet name. Evelyn lifted her chin slightly, her expression calm, composed, untouched by anger, and in that stillness, there was a presence that did not need to be asserted, only recognized. She shifted her weight again, not toward the street this time, but inward, grounding herself in the space she occupied, as if reclaiming it without taking a step. The broken cane remained in her hands, no longer a tool, but a symbol she refused to discard, and the way she held it spoke louder than any protest could have. A soft sound escaped somewhere in the crowd, not quite a word, not quite a sigh, just a human response to something difficult to name. Hayes swallowed, the motion small but visible, his gaze dropping briefly to the pavement before lifting again to her, and for the first time since he had approached, he did not see a situation to manage or a disruption to correct. He saw a person standing in front of him, steady, present, unchanged in dignity despite everything that had shifted around her. The city noise began to return in fragments, a distant horn, footsteps resuming, voices picking up where they had left off, but the moment itself lingered, suspended between what had been done and what could no longer be undone. Evelyn stood there, not asking, not accusing, simply existing with a quiet strength that reshaped the space around her, and in that silence, something deeper than words began to settle into place. It began with a sound that did not belong to the rhythm of the street, low at first, then growing clearer as it approached, the smooth hum of an engine built for presence rather than noise, and one by one, heads turned toward the curb as a black SUV eased to a stop just a few yards away from where Evelyn stood. The vehicle did not rush. It did not honk. It simply arrived, precise and deliberate, like it had always been meant to be there. The door opened with a soft click, and a man stepped out, his shoes touching the pavement with quiet certainty, his posture straight, controlled, every movement measured without hesitation. He paused for half a second, taking in the scene not with confusion, but with focus, his gaze moving across the small crowd, the officer, the fragments in Evelyn's hands, and then settling on her. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that did not need to rise to be heard. Evelyn's head turned immediately toward the sound, her expression softening in a way that had not appeared until now, recognition moving through her like warmth. "Marcus," she replied, her voice just as calm, but now touched with familiarity, with connection. The name moved through the air, and something in the crowd shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Officer Hayes straightened instinctively, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man now standing beside the woman he had moments ago tried to direct, something about the way he carried himself registering before any words were spoken. Marcus Carter stepped closer, not hurried, not aggressive, simply present, his attention fully on Evelyn as he gently reached out, not to take the broken pieces from her, but to steady her hand, his touch careful, respectful. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone low, controlled, but there was a weight behind it, something held back rather than expressed. Evelyn nodded once, her fingers relaxing slightly under his touch. "I am standing," she said softly, the same quiet strength in her voice, unchanged. Marcus exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more than the moment itself, then lifted his gaze, finally meeting Officer Hayes directly. The space between them tightened, not with noise but with awareness. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice even, professional, but unmistakably firm. "What happened here?" Hayes felt it then, the shift he could not ignore, not just in the man's tone, but in the way the air itself seemed to reorganize around him. There was no raised voice, no accusation, and yet the question did not feel optional. It felt inevitable. Hayes opened his mouth, then paused, his usual certainty not arriving as quickly as it once did, his eyes flicking briefly to Evelyn, then back to Marcus. The badge on his chest felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented in this moment. Marcus did not move closer. He did not need to. His presence held its ground without effort, and in that stillness, the balance of the situation had already begun to shift, quietly, completely, in a way that no one on that sidewalk could fully ignore. The question did not echo, but it settled, firm and unmoving, in the space between them, and for the first time since stepping onto that sidewalk, Officer Hayes felt the absence of an immediate answer press against him like weight. He drew in a breath, controlled, measured, his training urging him to respond with clarity, with authority, with something that would re-establish order. "She was obstructing the walkway," he said, the words coming out slower than intended, less certain than they should have been, as if even he could hear the distance between the statement and the moment unfolding around them. Marcus Carter did not react right away. He did not interrupt. He simply listened, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, allowing the explanation to exist fully before responding. Then his eyes shifted briefly downward, to the broken cane pieces still resting in Evelyn's hands, and something in his expression tightened, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested a line had been crossed. Somewhere beyond policy. "Obstructing," Marcus repeated quietly, not as a challenge, but as a clarification, the single word carrying more weight than a longer sentence ever could. Hayes nodded once, a small, automatic motion, though it did not carry the same confidence it once would have. Around them, the crowd remained silent, but the attention had sharpened, focused now not just on what had happened, but on what would be said next. Marcus shifted his stance slightly, stepping half a pace closer, not invading space, but narrowing the distance just enough to make the conversation unavoidable. And the appropriate response to that, he continued, his tone still calm, still controlled, was to remove the one tool she uses to navigate the street. It was not phrased as a question, but it did not need to be. Hayes opened his mouth again, but the structure he relied on did not come together the same way, the words forming and dissolving before they could fully settle. He glanced briefly at Evelyn, at the way she stood beside Marcus, unchanged, composed, holding the pieces with quiet care, and something in that image disrupted the logic he had been holding on to. Evelyn turned her head slightly toward Marcus, her hand lifting just enough to touch his sleeve, a gentle, grounding gesture. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice calm, steady. "It is all right." The words did not erase the moment. They did not excuse it. But they shifted something, redirecting the energy away from confrontation and towards something quieter, something deeper. Marcus paused, his gaze softening for just a second as he looked at her, then returning to Hayes with a different kind of focus, one that was no longer about anger, but about accountability. "It is not about whether she is all right," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "It is about what happened, and what it means." The air held that sentence, heavier than before, not because it was loud, but because it could not be dismissed. Hayes felt it settle, felt the shift in ground beneath him, the realization that this was no longer a simple interaction, no longer something that could be resolved with a directive or a step back. He straightened slightly, but the movement no longer carried the same certainty. The badge on his chest did not feel like control anymore. It felt like responsibility, and for the first time, he could not ignore the difference. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore, it felt complete, as if everything that needed to be said had already settled into place without needing to be spoken aloud, and in that stillness, Officer Hayes finally lowered his gaze, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, a quiet understanding forming where certainty once stood. He inhaled slowly, the breath deeper this time, and when he looked up again, his posture had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that changed the space around him. "I should not have done that," he said, his voice measured, steady, but no longer carrying the rigid edge it once had, each word placed carefully, as if he understood their weight now. The crowd did not react with sound, but something in the air eased, a tension releasing that no one had realized they were holding. Marcus watched him for a moment, his expression unreadable, then gave a slight nod, not in approval, but in acknowledgement that the moment had moved forward. Evelyn remained beside him, her hand still lightly resting against his sleeve, her other hand holding the broken pieces with the same quiet care. She tilted her head slightly toward the officer, listening, not to the words alone, but to what sat behind them. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly, her tone unchanged, calm, grounded, offering neither judgment nor dismissal. Hayes glanced at the cane again, then back at her, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, as if considering something beyond procedure, beyond protocol. "I will make sure this is replaced," he added, his voice quieter now, less about authority, more about responsibility. Evelyn gave a small nod, not as acceptance of a transaction, but as acknowledgement of effort. The moment did not demand more. It simply held. Marcus shifted his stance slightly, his hand still steady near his mother's, his presence no longer pressing, but present in a different way, one that allowed the scene to settle rather than escalate. A faint breeze moved through the street again, lifting the edges of clothing, carrying with it the distant hum of the city returning to its rhythm, cars moving, footsteps resuming, voices blending back into the everyday flow. A woman stepped forward gently this time, offering a quiet, "May I help you?" across, her voice respectful, patient, and Evelyn turned toward her with a soft expression, considering for a moment before nodding once. "Yes," she said, her voice warm, not because she needed saving, but because connection had been offered with care. Together, they aligned at the curb, the broken cane still in Evelyn's hand, but no longer the only way forward. The crosswalk's signal began again, its steady pulse marking the passage of time, and this time, when Evelyn stepped forward, she did so with guidance beside her, not replacing her strength, but walking with it. Hayes watched from a few feet back, his hands still, his expression quieter than before, the badge on his chest no longer a shield, but something he carried differently now. Marcus remained for a moment longer, his gaze following his mother as she crossed, then turned once toward the officer, not with anger, not with challenge, but with a look that held expectation without words, before stepping back toward the waiting vehicle. The street returned to motion, the moment dissolving into the flow of the day, but something had shifted beneath it all, something that would not be undone. On the other side of the street, Evelyn reached the sidewalk, the sunlight warming her face as she paused for a second, her fingers still holding the pieces, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and in that quiet, the world felt different, not louder, not brighter, but more aware, as if it had learned, if only for a moment, how to listen.